Many of them returned, or even second generation, those who were born in Argentina, went to Croatia to live. And this is where they were found with something that is called kalte Heimat, cold homeland. Basically, Croats didn't beg them with open arms.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast, brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
You are listening to the Transformative Podcast of the Research Center for the History of Transformations. My name is Jelena Đureinović. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Nikolina Židek, professor at IE University in Madrid, and we are talking about the Croatian diaspora in Argentina. Nikolina, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for the invitation, Jelena.
Nikolina's research broadly specializes in diaspora and memory studies. The reason why we are here today is her book, The Croatian Diaspora in Argentina, From Martyrs to Memory Guardians, which is coming out very soon with CEU Press. The book is the product of many years of research and fieldwork within the Croatian post-World War II diaspora in Latin America and Spain. And I'm more than happy about first gaining insight in the book before it comes out, but also talking about it today. To start and go into this topic, how did the Croats in Argentina work on preserving their identity, memory, and community in the years after the Second World War? How important was the belief that they would soon return to the homeland in this context?
So basically, after the Second World War, these Croats were mostly, members of the army or civilians that were sympathizers of the Nazi-aligned Independent State of Croatia, left Yugoslavia or left Croatia after the defeat. And then they were target or victims of post-war killings at Bleiburg Field, and those who managed to escape such fate found refuge not only in Argentina, also in the US, Australia, West Germany. But Argentina is important because the majority of the military and political leadership settled there. So this is where we can see that at least until 1970s, they were the most important political emigre center of Croatian diaspora abroad. And this is where we can see that because it was thousands of them, around 10,000 of them settled in Argentina, they created this community that preserved memory of this independent state of Croatia. And they did it through different institutions, right? So they did it through Catholic Church, Croatian Catholic Mission, cultural clubs, youth organizations, schools, even political organizations. There were around 7 parties there. There was also publishing activities. And also families played a crucial role in preserving this memory and also transmitting these stories about exile, war, and this displacement that represented their collective trauma. So through these networks, they preserved their language, their national tradition, but also this historical narrative that was rooted in this common traumatic history. And this was the axis of their collective identity. So also what is very important is that their belief that their stay abroad was going to be temporary. So many of them really believed that they would eventually return to free and independent Croatia. So this is why, especially in the beginning, they did not settle completely. They had these temporary houses, or they didn't furnish them or anything, because they thought that they shouldn't settle because they're going to go back home quickly. So this is where we can see that, this feeling or this belief also, reinforced the need to maintain the culture and also, political engagement and the sense of national belonging. And also, on another hand, this also conditioned them in the sense of their private lives, because they also tried to preserve their identity through these endogamous marriages. Because why would you marry a foreigner if you're going back home soon? So this is where they also tried to preserve the purity of the community, which is also an interesting thing if we think about them when it comes to their tools of intergenerational transmission of memory.
You did mention the central historical narrative of this community, which you referred to as the foundation myth. that is about the self-perception as exclusively victims of communist persecution and post-war killings, about displacement, while, of course, erasing the wartime fascist state and its atrocities. How did this community work on maintaining this myth? What exactly, you mentioned Bleiburg as well, what exactly was commemorated besides that?
So basically, what is important here is that, yes, as you also already pointed, the foundational myth means that after their defeat, the defeat itself was already a part of this traumatic narrative. Then they went through these post-war killings, which were by all means a traumatic event. And after that, they went through this kind of limbo of displaced people's camps, like refugee camps, for 3 years. It was like a purgatory until they eventually settled in Argentina. So this is where we can see that we have this formation of this narrative that they were exclusively victims because of how strong the victimization narrative was and because of how strong the trauma of defeat plus post-war killings plus exile. This is what they represented for them. And then it made them erase everything that happened before this. So how do you become a victim if you were also a victimizer? Well, by erasing the uncomfortable part of your history and also from the memory. So this means that they only insisted on what objectively happened to them, that they were defeated, they were victims of these killings, and they also went through the refugee camps. However, how they did it is that then they framed it as not only them being victims of communist persecution, but also eventually and over time, with the second and third generation, then they polished and whitewashed this memory as being killed because they were Croats who only loved their homeland. So in that sense, we can see that this memory, first of all, their narrative has never been challenged because they were 10 or 12,000 kilometers away from the counter narrative. So there was no possibility of having any clash with another narrative, although there were some moments that we can see that they are faced with uncomfortable truths. However, they managed to frame everything as Yugoslav propaganda, anti-Croat propaganda. So this is how then you come to this homogeneous and quite solid narrative that is never questioned because you are a community of victims, right? So anything that contradicts your victimhood is either denied or it is justified. And this usually occurs when you have high identification with your own in-group. So when your own in-group did something wrong to another group, then you tend to reject it by all means because of this high identification, which happens usually with nationalism and also with this community that really had this very, very strong experiences after the war that made them consolidate in such a way.
The Croatian independent state is one of the most important things, one of the most important narrative in the Croat community in Argentina. In the 90s, that independence is achieved. And I'm just curious, how did this community that had been thinking about the independent state for decades, how did they relate to the war and the independence of Croatia?
It is a fact that they constantly worked for 45 years. They were constantly working on the project of independent Croatia. In the first period, they thought that they were the carriers. They were the ones that should recreate the independent Croatia, which is also another contradiction because their independent Croatia was not independent. It was Italian and German Nazi protectorate, so it wasn't independent at all. So then it also wasn't a state. And also, we can also question whether it was Croatian, but let's not get into that. So this is one thing that we can see, that they thought that they were the carriers of this national feeling. And for them, Croatia within Yugoslavia disappeared. This is another thing that we also have to take into account. So they were the ones who were the real Croats who had to abandon the country because they wanted an independent Croatia, while all of the people who stayed in Croatia within Yugoslavia were not real Croats. And this is something that was a recurring topic in all of their writings, in their speeches, etc. And then later in 1970s and 1980s, they realized that they cannot do it themselves, that they really need local Croats in Croatia to help them with the independent project. And this is where then they realized that they should really resort to them. I think that the hinge moment was the Croatian Spring in 1971, where they could see that there were some protests and that not everybody was aligned with communist Yugoslavia, or that there were protests regarding certain liberalization or certain rights, etc. So this is where we can see that then also in 1970s, Franjo Tuđman emerges as this, person, a Croat who opened his eyes, right, who they could talk to from Croatia, although in the beginning not everybody was really accepting him because he did have a communist past, he was a partisan general. Then they also later whitewashed it quite well so that then they could choose him as the leader of the Croatian independence. And then when this independence came, so how do you create a coherent narrative about it, right? So then they saw this independence as a recreation of their independent state, of their lifelong or 1,000-year-old dream. And then they saw it as also the fulfillment of their project. And also they did, and this is one very important thing, that they really did everything they could to help independent Croatia, which means that they did help it financially, they did help it, there were also some people who participated in war and got killed, but also there were a lot of people, and the diaspora financing of 1990s Croatia is still an under-researched topic. And also one thing that we can see that later in 2000s led to their disillusionment, because they were practically used in 1990s when they were needed, and then later they felt that they were pretty much betrayed, right? And that they didn't get what they hoped for, because when they came there, also many of them returned, or even second generation, those who were born in Argentina, went to Croatia to live. And this is where they were found with something that is called kalte Heimat, right? Cold homeland, because basically Croats didn't expect them with open arms, right? So in Croatia, they were not that welcomed as heroes, quite the contrary. And this is where these two narratives started to clash. And this is one very important moment that, how it was resolved is yet another thing that we should think about, this Franjo Tuđman's project of reconciliations of Croats, all Croat reconciliation, that later, as we can see what is happening today, completely backfired, and their narrative came to the full peak last year in July.
Maybe for our listeners who don't know what happened last year in July, you could elaborate a bit on that.
Well, in general, since the last elections, Domovinski Pokret, the Homeland Movement, which is an extreme right-wing party, populist party, that does practically try to recreate some parts of the ideology or the narrative of the diaspora, and also some are members of diaspora. First of all, they started to legitimize the diaspora narrative, and also legitimized it by entering government. So also the mainstream party, Croatian Democratic Union, also has a lot to do with this, because they, in this competition for votes, so that they wouldn't get their votes stolen by the extreme right, they also started flirting with them. This led to several, statements, and they started to also limit certain freedoms, etc., etc. But it basically peaked in July 2025, where this extreme nationalist singer Marko Perković Thompson organized a concert in Zagreb Hippodrome, where 500,000 people came wearing this Independent State of Croatia Ustaša memorabilia, openly showing this neo-fascist nostalgia. And it peaked with Marko Perković Thompson starting the Ustaša salutation for the homeland, and then 500,000 people of the audience responding ready. So with this is a very symbolic moment that really showed how this Ustaša narrative has fully come back, democratic Croatian narrative. And this is one thing that we should observe. What is going to happen with this was it really only an incident, is the Croatian Democratic Union, the mainstream party in the coalition, are they only flirting with it, or did they let the genie out of the bottle, and are they going to be able to control it?
And was the genie ever really back inside the bottle?
I mean, there were some leaks always, at least since 1990s. There was some flirting, etc. But although the diaspora did celebrate Franjo Tuđman as their candidate and their president, he never really led them completely take over the narrative, right? This is he's the one who insisted on the anti-fascist fundaments of the constitution, etc., etc. So they were quite under control with Tudjman. He did try to give something back because of all of their contributions and try to create this all-Croat reconciliation, which is also based on very, very controversial example from Franco's Valley of the Fallen, which may look from the outside as a plausible example, but for the Spaniards, this is quite offensive, especially for those from the defeated side, from the Republican side. This is not a solution that was viable, neither in Spain, nor it was in Croatia. He did hope that he would, with this, he would really create something, but it completely backfired. He practically legitimized them, and in the long term, especially after Croatia joined European Union and with the general rise of the extreme right in Europe, we can see that they are like fully back.
To go back to the book, because I think we could discuss the far right rise for a bit longer, but to go back to your book, I think what you do really nicely in the book is presenting this longue durée history of the community from its building to its transformation until today. And I would just ask you a little bit about the change of generations and also what you call planetary Croats and the relationship of this generation with the homeland starting from 2000s.
Well, yes. In fact, what I did is that I dug in the archives, I looked at their memoirs, I talked to them, and apart from looking at their political activities, etc., I really tried to understand how this intergenerational transmission of memory works, right? What do you resort to? And this is where we have to do this weaving of the fabric of the whole community so that we can see that, of course, that it is natural and that it is normal that people who grew up with this memory as if it were their own, that of course that then their views may seem to us that come from Croatia or from the outside world, outside of the community, they may seem strange to us. But if you look at how they were brought up, all of these tools of transmission, their microcosmos, Croatian microcosmos in Argentina, then it's natural for you that if you were born or if you are carrying a name of a cousin of your father that was killed during the Bleiburg, etc., you have this imprinted on your destiny, right? So what is very important is that in 2000s, so all of this second and third generation that were brought up in this environment, suddenly they lose roots because their parents or grandparents die. And this is where we have this generational shift that is very important, because you can see that this is where they also start to get the feeling that it's their mission today to preserve the memory. And this is where we can see that also because of what happened in 1990s and especially in 2000s with the change of the government in Croatia, where they were no longer celebrated or needed, they also felt that, okay, so we got, and this is how they feel, we are the ones who got independent Croatia back. We lived on the basis of this dream of independent Croatia, and now that we got it, it's not what we dreamt of, how we were brought up, what our grandparents or parents wanted. And this is where they feel this shift, not only generational shift, but there's this shift, who is us and them, right? Because during the Cold War, us and them was communists against Croats, right? But now us and them is diaspora against homeland Croatia, because they are the ones that don't understand what real Croatia is. And this is where, how do we preserve our narrative and how do we preserve our identity, where practically nobody of the first generation is no longer alive? Well, we then reinterpret ourselves or reconfigure ourselves as the true Croats. And this is where the networks and social media come, because then they realize, and this is where they draw from this Davor Pavona's term, planetary Croats, we can be anywhere in the world, but we do belong to the Croatian people, and we are the ones who can contribute to this, and we have our know-how, and we are going to help them get on the right right? So this is what we can see, and this is where they start engaging a lot with social networks, and we know in general that social networks, they can be positive or negative, whichever use you give them, but for them it was very important because now their network started to be bigger because they finally found people who resonate with them wherever in the world, and they also started to listen to some kind of music, use certain symbols, and reinforce and strengthen their own identity as the true and real Croats who were accidentally born in Argentina or in Australia or in West Germany because of Bleiburg. Bleiburg symbolizes everything that happened to them, right? So it was just an accidental thing, being born thousands of kilometers away, third or fourth generation. And in fact, this is why we are special, because we are the ones who had to flee because we only loved Croatia, right? So this is how this planetary Croats work. And also, this was also reinforced with all of this scholarship that Croatia started to give diaspora to learn Croatian. So then they go to Croatia, then go back. So there's a lot of exchange too. So then it also reinforces and strengthens their identity.
And for the end, something that we haven't really discussed or mentioned today is the memory culture in Argentina. And I'm just curious, how does this community that we can also refer to as the community of memory, its practices, narratives, communicate and connect, if at all, with the memory culture in Argentina today?
Well, currently memory culture in Argentina, if we think about 21st century in general, not talking about the current government, because they are quite trying to also revert certain issues regarding the memory of the dictatorship in Argentina. They did take up their practices, especially in 1980s and 1990s. That was the peak of the human rights movements and memory in Argentina regarding the civil military dictatorship from 1976 to 1983. And we can see that because in spite of the fact that they deny that they're Argentines really, and they were really born in Argentina and they went to school in Argentina and they're surrounded by Argentinian society, they do take up their practices, and you can see by how they reconfigure their memory since 1980s. They start seeking memory and justice, while the Argentinian slogans was memory, truth, and justice. And it's also not a coincidence that they take out the truth, because they have the truth, so they don't need it. So they only seek memory and justice. They also talk about Croatian nunca más, right? So this is where we can see that they also download Argentinian cultural practices to their own memory. They talk about the disappeared people in Bleiburg. Disappeared, of course, disappearances is a native category from Argentina. So this is where we can see that whether they like it or not, they are interconnected. And we can see that they start downloading these practices from the Argentinian society because this is their everyday lives, it's their reality. So this is like a natural thing that then they would also take up the practices they feel that fit their own cultural memory, right?
Thank you again, Nikolina, for joining me today for this conversation. The book is coming out very soon as we are speaking, so I would like to tell anyone who is listening to really keep an eye on it, to know more about everything that we discussed today. This was the Transformative Podcast of the Research Center for the History of Transformations, today with me, Jelena Đureinović, and Nikolina Židek.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to promote my book.